I stood on the land my grandfather spent his life protecting, watching as bulldozers tore into the soil, erasing generations of hard work with every scoop of dirt. The Sunny Pines HOA stole my family's legacy, forging documents, manipulating officials, and bulldozing my inheritance into dust, all for profit. When I confronted them, they laughed, blocking my driveway, cutting my water, threatening my future. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea what was coming. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to fight for land. I'd spent the last 10 years working in an office, barely remembering to water the cactus on my desk, let alone thinking about farming. But when my grandfather, Joe Morgan, passed away last spring, everything changed. He left me his 200-acre farm in Meadowcreek, a place I'd only visited during childhood summers. I thought it would sit untouched for a while, maybe I'd lease it out, maybe I'd sell a few acres. But then I got the call. "Jack, they're tearing up your land." Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather's neighbor for 40 years, was practically shouting through the phone. "The Sunny Pines people, they've got bulldozers on your east fields. You need to come down here now." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a boundary issue. Maybe some overeager construction crew had gotten their directions wrong. But as I sped toward Meadowcreek, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Grandpa was stubborn, he never would have sold that land. And yet, someone was already building on it. Something wasn't right, and I was about to find out just how deep the deception ran. I slammed my car door and stormed toward the construction site, my heart pounding with frustration. Bulldozers clawed at the earth where my grandfather's crops once grew, tearing through soil that had fed our family for generations. Dust choked the air, the sharp scent of diesel mixing with the acrid bite of freshly disturbed land. A massive sign loomed over the destruction, "Future home of Sunny Pines East, luxury homes starting at $450,000. My stomach twisted. A woman in a spotless white blouse and designer sunglasses stood near a line of survey stakes, barking orders into her phone. She barely glanced at me as I approached, until I stepped into her line of sight. "Can I help you?" Her voice was clipped, professional, impatient. "Yeah, you can explain why you're digging up my land." That got her attention. She lowered her sunglasses, scanning me with thinly veiled condescension. "I'm sorry, and you are?" "Jack Morgan. Joe Morgan's grandson. The owner of this farm." A flicker of something crossed her face, surprise. Annoyance. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. She extended a manicured hand. "Diane Reynolds, president of the Sunny Pines Homeowners Association." I ignored her hand. I didn't approve any sale. My grandfather would never sell this land. Diane sighed, like she was explaining basic math to a slow student. "Actually, Sunny Pines Development purchased this parcel last year. The sale was finalized 9 months ago. We have all the necessary approvals and permits." "That's impossible." My voice rose, my hands clenched into fists. "He was sick last year, barely able to leave the house. He wouldn't have sold it without telling me." Diane's smile was sharp, practiced. "Perhaps you should check your records." She handed me a business card, her nails tapping against my palm. "But I assure you, Mr. Morgan, this is a done deal." I stared at the machines tearing apart my family's land. Frustration boiled into outrage. They were lying. I didn't know how, but I was going to find out, and I was going to stop them. Back at my grandfather's farmhouse, I paced the creaky wooden floors, my mind racing. The scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and aged wood filled the small office where Grandpa had spent decades managing this land. If Diane Reynolds was telling the truth, then my grandfather had sold the farm before he passed, but I knew that was a lie. Grandpa was stubborn, fiercely protective of this land. He once chased a real estate agent off the property with a shotgun for even suggesting a sale. There was no way he had signed it away. I pulled open his old filing cabinet, flipping through folders thick with records, crop yields, rainfall reports, receipts for equipment repairs, everything meticulously documented in his precise, no-nonsense handwriting. But nothing about a land sale. My fingers dug through drawer after drawer, frustration mounting. "Come on, Grandpa, what were you looking for?" Mrs. Thompson's words rang in my ears. He said he needed to find something important to protect the farm. Then, my foot caught on something loose. I looked down. A floorboard near the desk was slightly raised. Heart pounding, I pried it open with my pocket knife, revealing a dusty metal box tucked inside the space beneath. A small key dangled from a nail under the desk, just where Grandpa would have left it. With shaking hands, I unlocked the box. Inside were three things. 1. The original deed to the farm, my grandfather's signature bold and certain. 2. Property surveys dating back to 1910, showing the original boundaries that stretched far beyond what Sunny Pines had claimed. 3. A letter addressed to me. I unfolded it, my breath catching as I recognized Grandpa's handwriting. "Jack, if you're reading this, someone is trying to take what's ours. I never signed away this land. If they say I did, they're lying. Look at the original survey. Compare it to what's on record now. The truth is in the boundaries." My pulse thundered in my ears. He knew. He saw this coming. Diane Reynolds and her HOA weren't just stealing land, they were trying to erase the proof. Well, they had just made their biggest mistake. I had the proof now, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bulldozers tearing through my grandfather's land, churning up the soil where his crops once grew. But now I had something Diane Reynolds didn't expect: proof. The original surveys and deed weren't just pieces of paper, they were the key to unraveling whatever fraud had allowed Sunny Pines to take this land. But before I made a move, I needed to be sure. At dawn, I packed the documents into a folder and headed straight for town. My first stop was the county records office. The building smelled of dust and old ink, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. A woman at the front desk, Carolyn Mitchell, greeted me with a tired smile. "I need to pull the official land records for the Morgan farm," I said, keeping my voice steady. She typed into her computer, frowning slightly. "Morgan farm? Let's see. We have records of a sale to Sunny Pines Development last year." I tensed. "Can I see the signature on that document?" She turned the screen toward me. My gut twisted into knots. The signature said, Joseph Morgan, but it wasn't my grandfather's handwriting. The lines were shakier, uneven, like someone had copied it. Carolyn glanced at me. "Something wrong?" "This isn't his signature," I said. "And I can prove it." I slid the original deed across the counter. She compared the two, her expression shifting from neutral to concerned. "This is highly irregular," she admitted. "We should have records of a title transfer. But if this signature is fake..." She stopped, glancing over my shoulder. I turned just as a figure in a dark suit walked into the records office. Mark Wilson, head of the county planning board. One of Diane's people. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked annoyed. "Mr. Morgan," he said smoothly. "I heard you were digging through old paperwork." My stomach clenched. They knew. I swallowed hard, gripping my folder tighter. I wasn't just searching for answers anymore. I had just stepped into a fight I wasn't prepared for. Mark Wilson didn't waste time. He sauntered up to the counter like he owned the place, his neatly pressed suit and smug expression making it clear he was used to being the most important man in the room. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Morgan?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. I slid the forged document back toward Carolyn, keeping my expression neutral. "Just doing some research." You know, making sure my grandfather's affairs were in order. Mark glanced at the screen behind the desk and smirked. Ah. I see. You're clinging to the past. Jack, the world moves forward, whether we like it or not. He tapped the deed with a perfectly manicured finger. Your grandfather was an old man. Maybe he didn't mention selling the land. That happens sometimes. My jaw clenched, but I kept my voice steady. He didn't sell. And if you're so sure he did, why does this signature look nothing like his? Carolyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly aware that things were getting tense. Mr. Wilson, if there's a discrepancy in the records, we'll need to investigate. Mark's smile faltered for just a second before he regained his usual arrogance. Of course, Carolyn. By all means, do your investigation. He turned back to me. Jack, I'd hate to see you waste time fighting something that can't be undone. Sunny Pines is already building. People have already bought homes. Maybe it's time to think about what's best for everyone. I knew exactly what he meant. Walk away. Take the loss. Let them get away with it. But Mark had made a mistake. He thought I was some city boy who didn't know how the world worked. He thought I'd fold under pressure. Instead, I gave him a slow, deliberate smile. Funny thing about legal disputes, Mark. Sometimes they take unexpected turns. His eyes narrowed slightly. Careful, Jack. This isn't just about land. It's about knowing which battles are worth fighting. I leaned in just enough for him to hear. Oh, I know exactly which battles to fight. And trust me, Mark, you're gonna wish you weren't on the losing side of this one. I stood at the front of the crowded town hall, gripping the microphone as I scanned the faces before me, people who had been bullied, silenced, and pushed to their limits by Mark Wilson and his cronies at Sunny Pines. The air buzzed with a mixture of anger and anticipation, a room full of people who were just now realizing they weren't alone in their fight. My grandfather built this farm with his own hands, I began, my voice steady but filled with conviction. He fought to keep this land, not just for our family, but for this community. And now, it's not just my land that's at stake, it's yours too. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I could see heads nodding, shoulders squaring, people straightening in their chairs as if something inside them was finally waking up. I turned toward the front row, where Sarah Jenkins, a single mother, sat with her arms crossed. Sarah, they fined you $500 for planting tomatoes in your backyard, didn't they? She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. And Mr. Patel, I continued, shifting my gaze to the elderly man beside her. They threatened to take your home over an unapproved wheelchair ramp, even though you built it for your wife. His hands curled into fists on his lap. This isn't just about land, I said, my voice rising. This is about power. About a group of people who think they can make their own rules, who believe they can trample over anyone who doesn't fit their idea of perfection. But here's the thing, they only win if we let them. A charged silence hung in the air. Then, slowly, a hand rose in the back. Then another. And another. I'm done letting them push us around, Sarah said, standing up. If you're starting a fight, Jack, count me in. That was it. The turning point. The moment they realized they weren't just victims, they were a force. And Sunny Pines was about to find out just how powerful a united community could be. The next morning, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in years, people working together. The soft murmur of voices, the clatter of tools, the rhythmic thud of hammer against wood. I stepped onto the porch, and what I saw nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Neighbors, dozens of them, had gathered at my grandfather's farmhouse. Some were hauling wooden planks to the side of the house, others were fixing the sagging fence that Sunny Pines developers had neglected for years. Kids ran between the adults, handing out water bottles, while a few elderly residents sat in lawn chairs, directing the chaos like seasoned generals. Jack. Sarah Jenkins called, wiping sweat from her brow. Figured if Sunny Pines wants to block your utilities and harass you, we might as well show them what real community looks like. I walked toward her, my throat tightening. I didn't ask for this. You didn't have to, said Mr. Patel, rolling out a hose to water what was left of my grandfather's vegetable garden. They wanted to make an example out of you. But now, they've made an example out of us. I turned and saw Mr. Grayson, the man who had lost his home to Sunny Pines harassment years ago. He was carrying a bundle of fresh blueprints under his arm. Last night, I pulled out some old plans from when I was an architect, he said, spreading them over a makeshift table. Your grandfather wanted to expand this farm into a community market years ago. Maybe it's time we finally build it. A buzz of excitement spread through the crowd. You mean fight back by making something better? I asked. Sarah grinned. It's exactly what they don't expect. For the first time since this war began, I felt something other than rage or exhaustion. I felt hope. They had tried to isolate me, to crush me under the weight of their control. But they had made one mistake. They didn't realize they weren't just fighting me. They were fighting an entire community that was ready to take back what was theirs. The Sunny Pines HOA board thought they could bury their secrets, but they never expected them to resurface in the most spectacular way possible, right in front of the entire community. The town hall meeting was packed, standing room only. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak up sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for answers. At the front of the room, Diane Reynolds sat stiffly, flanked by the other board members, her usual confident smirk absent for the first time. I walked to the podium, letting the silence settle before speaking. You've all heard their version of the story, I began, my voice steady. Now, let's talk about the truth. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the projector screen behind me lit up. The first image appeared, an old property map from my grandfather's files, showing the original boundaries of our land. Murmurs spread through the crowd. This, I continued, is the legal record of my family's property. And this, I clicked again, bringing up a document with Diane's signature, is the fraudulent boundary adjustment that reduced my land by 80 acres. Gasps filled the room. Diane shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't done. I brought up bank statements next. This, I said, pointing to the numbers, is where your HOA fees have been going. Over $400,000 funneled into fake consulting companies owned by the board members' families. A stunned silence followed. Then, someone in the audience yelled, "She stole from us." Another voice, louder, "She scammed us." Diane shot to her feet. These are baseless accusations. You have no proof. I smiled. Actually, I do. I clicked again. The next slide wasn't a document, it was a video. Security footage of Diane and her associates sneaking onto my property, planting fraudulent survey markers in the dead of night. The room erupted. Shouts. Accusations. Residents stood, demanding answers. The sheriff, who had been sitting quietly at the back, rose and walked toward the front. Diane Reynolds, he said, pulling out his handcuffs, "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying legal documents." The look on her face. Absolute poetic justice. The aftermath of Diane Reynolds' arrest sent shockwaves through the entire community. The once invincible leader of the Sunny Pines HOA had been led out of the town hall in handcuffs, her perfectly manicured hands now restrained by cold steel. But her downfall was just the beginning. In the following days, homeowners began coming forward with their own horror stories, stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial ruin at the hands of the HOA. Elderly couples who had been forced to sell their homes at absurdly low prices. Families who had been fined into bankruptcy over minor infractions. One woman, near tears, told me how she'd been threatened with foreclosure because her garden gnome wasn't aesthetically consistent with the community's design. I spent hours sorting through the evidence, working with my lawyer and a growing coalition of homeowners who wanted justice. We combed through financial records, uncovering more layers of fraud than we'd even imagined. It wasn't just about my grandfather's land anymore. Diane and her cronies had turned the HOA into their personal gold mine, bleeding residents dry while funneling money into their own pockets. Then came the lawsuits. One by one, families who had been wronged filed claims against the HOA. Some sought financial compensation for illegal fines, others demanded the return of their stolen homes. And when the media got wind of the scandal, it exploded. News crews camped outside the Sunny Pines office, shoving microphones into the faces of any board members who hadn't already resigned in disgrace. But the real satisfaction came when we discovered Diane's worst fear: her real estate empire was crumbling. The fraudulent property sales, the shell companies, the backroom deals with corrupt officials, it all unraveled under scrutiny. Her family's development firm, once poised to make millions off stolen land, was now under federal investigation. One evening, as I sat on my grandfather's porch, I received an email from my lawyer. Diane's assets were frozen. Her personal fortune, built on deceit, was gone. I leaned back in my chair, looking out over the field she had tried to steal. Justice wasn't just coming. It had arrived. The day the final ruling came down, I stood on the steps of the courthouse, gripping the edge of the railing as I listened to the judge's decision. The land was mine. Every fraudulent boundary change, every shady deal, every forged signature had been exposed for what it was: a desperate attempt to rewrite history. The court had ruled in my favor, and in doing so, had dismantled the entire foundation of Diane Reynolds' corrupt empire. Inside the courtroom, Diane sat frozen, her usual smug composure shattered. The judge had just declared her personally liable for damages owed to homeowners she had defrauded, the community members she had fined into bankruptcy, and the families she had bullied out of their homes. She wasn't just disgraced, she was ruined. The HOA, once her personal kingdom, was dissolved. Homeowners would be refunded their stolen fees, and the illegally built homes on my land. They were now mine to do with as I pleased. The moment I stepped outside, I was met with a wave of applause. Neighbors, homeowners, and former HOA victims filled the courthouse steps, cheering, clapping, shaking my hand. "You did it, Jack," someone called out. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had first called me about the construction, wiped away tears. "Your grandfather would be so proud." News cameras flashed. Reporters pushed forward, asking how it felt to win. I turned to them, but instead of speaking about revenge or personal victory, I said, "This was never about me. This was about the people of this community, people who deserved fairness, honesty, and a home free from fear." And as for the land? The next day, I signed the documents that would transfer the illegally developed properties to their rightful owners. The families who had been forced to sell at a loss. They were getting their homes back. The wetlands Diane had tried to pave over. They were placed under permanent protection. For the first time in months, I took a deep breath. The land was safe. The people were free. And Diane? She was exactly where she belonged, powerless. The fallout from Diane Reynolds' downfall rippled through Meadowcreek like a tidal wave, sweeping away the old power structures and leaving space for something new, something just. With the corrupt HOA disbanded and the fraudulent property claims overturned, the community was finally free from the iron grip of Diane and her network of enforcers. But the fight hadn't just been about reclaiming land. It had been about restoring trust, about proving that no one, no matter how rich, connected, or ruthless, could rewrite the truth when a community stood together. As Diane's assets were seized, her luxury SUV repossessed, and her high society friends distanced themselves, she was left scrambling for a lifeline that didn't exist. She had ruled through fear, and without power, she was nothing. Her final act of defiance came in a press statement, where she blamed the downfall on outsiders, who didn't understand the importance of property value protections. It was laughable. The community had seen through her long before the courts did. Meanwhile, the former HOA board members who had enabled her corruption scattered like rats from a sinking ship. Some resigned in disgrace, others faced their own legal battles, but none would ever hold power here again. With the HOA officially dissolved, the next step was building something better. The Meadowcreek Community Association formed, a transparent, resident-led organization that focused on protecting the environment, supporting homeowners, and ensuring no one was ever targeted again for daring to grow a tomato plant or paint their front door the wrong shade of blue. I sat on my grandfather's porch that evening, watching the sun set over the restored fields. The land had been saved, but more than that, the people had reclaimed their voice. Mrs. Thompson, Raj, the Johnsons, and even Gerald Fisher, the former treasurer who had turned against Diane, joined me for a quiet celebration. "We did it," Raj said, raising a glass of sweet tea. I nodded, looking out at the land that would never again be stolen. "Yeah, we did." The sun rose over Meadowcreek, casting a golden glow over the land that had been fought for, defended, and ultimately restored. What had once been the battleground of corporate greed and corruption had now become a symbol of resilience, a testament to what a united community could achieve. The people of Meadowcreek had spent years living under the shadow of Diane Reynolds' oppressive HOA, their voices silenced, their choices dictated by a woman who saw them as nothing more than pawns in her game. But not anymore. At the town square, families gathered, children ran freely, and neighbors who had once hesitated to speak up now stood together, stronger than ever. The newly formed Meadowcreek Community Association had its first official meeting, not behind closed doors, not in secret boardrooms, but right in the open, where every homeowner had a voice. This wasn't just about rules and regulations, it was about freedom, fairness, and shared responsibility. Raj and the Johnsons had started a community garden, where anyone could grow their own food without fear of a violation notice. Mrs. Thompson spearheaded a historical preservation committee, ensuring that the legacy of the land, and of those who had fought for it, would never be forgotten. And in the biggest act of poetic justice, Diane's former HOA office was now a public library and resource center, where people could learn about their homeowner rights, so no one would ever be blindsided the way we had been. As I stood in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by the very people who had once been afraid to fight back, I realized something: this wasn't just a victory. It was a rebirth. The people had taken back their land, their homes, and most importantly, their power.